As 8-year-old Tommy stepped into the hospital room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. His parents had just welcomed a new member of the family, baby swaddled in a white blanket. However, the words that he spoke next came as a shock to everyone present, particularly to his father. This ultimately led to his father filing for divorce, launching a cascade of events that would alter their lives forever. Tommy's father couldn't believe what he was hearing. Did Tommy really say that, or was he hearing something after the long night of his daughter's birth? I was skeptical, but now I'm sure, he thought in the quiet of the hospital room. Their future was at stake, to say the least. Tommy's father looked at his unsuspecting wife and doubted all the love he gave her. The more he thought he knew, the worse it got. He thought that she had been hiding something, but now he was sure. She wasn't the same woman to him since that day. After being convinced of what Tommy said, Tommy's father finds out that he has no choice but to divorce his wife, Tommy's mother. He knew the devastation it would mean for Tommy and his newborn, but so did staying married. But what did Tommy say? What was Tommy's mother hiding from her father? Despite the endless joy that new babies bring, Tommy's father, Henry, soon became preoccupied with more than just his newborn daughter. Tommy's welcome to his sister confirmed his long-held suspicions about his wife, Andrea, and Henry couldn't help but look at her with disgust. But Henry was a wise man. In his years of experience as a local politician, he has long discovered that there is nothing worse than rushing to his conclusions, and he wanted to gather evidence against his wife first. For now, he didn't have time for that. After all, she was recovering from her birth. But it won't be long before the first pieces of evidence come forward. After all the checks had been carried out on his new daughter, and she appeared to be a very healthy girl, Henry could start thinking about his next steps. He started by taking Tommy home so he could finally rest from the long day of his little sister's birth. Henry now had the perfect opportunity to ask Tommy what exactly he was referring to just before. Father and son sat in the car together. Henry wanted to hear more from his son about what he had said, so he began cautiously. "Are you proud of Mommy?" Tommy nodded positively, as he was so tired from the long night that he could barely speak. Then Henry quietly asked, "But you're not always proud of your mother, am I?" Tommy looked at his father questioningly, then looked down at his feet. Tommy clearly wanted to say something, but he dared not. Henry told his son to always be honest, but Tommy bit his tongue and went straight to sleep. This obviously didn't work. Henry needed a different strategy. Although Henry himself was also very tired and could sleep on the couch for an hour, his rest was quickly disturbed. He was called by the hospital because his wife Andrea had asked about him. Henry asked if he should be concerned, but the doctor said nothing was wrong. Andrea had her own reason for this. Andrea had also heard what Tommy said when he welcomed his new sister, so she wanted to make sure she could nip Henry's suspicions in the bud. Calling him was the first step. Crafty as she was, she had a clear tactic in mind that Henry had fallen for before. As soon as Henry entered and hesitantly approached Andrea began her way of captivating him. She acted extremely motherly as she stroked his forehead and asked him how his work was going. Henry gruffly replied that he had been out of work because of the birth. Andrea's response surprised him. Because Andrea told him she thought it was more important he went back to work rather than him looking after Tommy. She added that because he was such a fantastic politician, the city council could not do without him. But Henry only heard one thing. Andrea didn't want him to spend time with Tommy, so her secret could go undiscovered. But Henry played along. He said, without looking at her, that he was indeed going back to work soon and that she was right. Andrea acted satisfied, as if she had everything under control. Henry couldn't stand her but didn't want to show it. He knew inside that a divorce was inevitable and his heart broke. To keep up appearances, Henry actually went to his office. He had put himself forward as the new chairman and must, therefore, actually show his face around the office a lot. However, he had taken Tommy to the office and had his assistant look after him. Tommy was rested this time and ready to talk. Henry's assistant Julia was excellent with children and took him to play at the park. However, Henry had not yet had the chance to inform Julia about the suspicions he had, so Julia was unaware of anything. That would soon change, as she was capable of more than he knew. Henry had tremendous faith in Julia's sincerity. He knew that if he shared his concerns and suspicions, she would be able to understand them without judging him. Unfortunately, Henry didn't know that Julia already knew who Andrea was, and that she knew her better than he would have liked. As soon as Julia came back from the park, Henry took her aside. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her he would like it if she asked his son why he said something so crazy when he first saw his sister. Julia immediately agreed. Henry responded happily to her cooperation, but found it odd that she asked nothing more. Henry's rest of the day was completely packed with meetings, so he had no view of Tommy and Julia. He didn't even have time to have a normal lunch with Tommy and hastily ate a salad at his desk. Then, between two meetings, he had a moment to check on Tommy. But Tommy and Julia were already somewhere else entirely. They went to the hospital to visit Andrea. Henry read this on a note left by Julia and got very angry. This was the last thing he needed. He simply wanted her to stay with Tommy at the office and nothing more. Fortunately, luck would soon be coming his way. Henry decided to call Julia right away to tell her to come back as soon as possible. After all, maybe they had just left. Julia answered, but Henry only heard the phone hiss. He soon found out that she had answered her phone by mistake and it was still in her purse, which Julia often did. And then he heard Andrea's voice in the background. The timing was right in Henry's favor as he heard Andrea say, "Henry must never find out. I don't care how much you have to look after Tommy for that. Make sure he doesn't find out." Henry knew enough and immediately got into the car. Things were about to unfold. On the way, Henry got very angry. What had he done to deserve this? He now missed a very important meeting which could jeopardize his future as chairman just because his wife kept terrible things from him. And what about poor Tommy, who so inadvertently set this all in motion? Henry arrived at the hospital and soon saw Julia and Tommy in the lobby. Julia looked up in shock because she had seen that she had pocket-dialed Henry and he may have heard things. Henry walked up to them determinedly and told Julia she could go back to the office, grabbing Tommy's hand. Julia protested for a moment but understood there was nothing to argue against. She said goodbye to Tommy and left the hospital. Henry walked upstairs with Tommy and gently told him he would like Tommy to help him once they got to Mum. Henry knew that a confrontation awaited him that he would never have wanted. Tommy had no idea what was going on. He had just seen his mother, so why did his father take him back inside the hospital? And why did Julia have to leave? But he just held his father's hand and followed him inside, not knowing what was about to unfold in front of his eyes. As they walked through the hospital, Henry had to try his best not to let his emotions get the best of him. His blood was boiling from the betrayal, but he had to be discreet with his words, because Andrea, the master manipulator she was, could easily diverge the situation. And that was exactly what she did. As soon as Henry and Tommy walked through the door, her smile went up. She was surprised to see them as Julia had just left. "Hi, Henry, what are you doing here?" she said, spreading her arms for a hug. But Henry was in no mood for affection. "Cut the act, Andrea," he said firmly. Andrea frowned. "What do you mean, babe?" "I called Julia and heard you telling her I could never find out about something. So what are you hiding from me?" Andrea looked at her husband and shook her head. "Oh, Henry, you have it all wrong. I was planning a surprise for you, silly," Andrea said, slightly annoyed. This took Henry by surprise. For a second, he doubted if he had imagined everything, but then he remembered not to fall for Andrea's innocent charades. He needed more evidence, something that she couldn't talk herself out of. So he took Tommy by the arm and went back to work. He apologized to Julia for snapping at her, but he only did that to keep up his own charade. She had to believe he really thought Andrea was going to surprise him. Only then would his plan work, and to his surprise, she believed him immediately. For the next few days, Henry kept a close eye on his wife and assistant. Andrea had returned home from the hospital and spent her days caring for their newborn daughter and Tommy. Henry went to work as usual and waited for an opportunity to pop up. He had to catch his wife in the act. To Henry's luck, the perfect opportunity arrived sooner than he had anticipated. When he got in his car to go to work, he noticed his car's Bluetooth was still connected to Andrea's phone, and to make it even better, she was on a phone call with Julia. All Henry had to do was sit back and listen to the conversation. "All right, so I'll see you guys this afternoon," Andrea asked Julia. "Yes, we'll be at the restaurant around 12. Henry is in a meeting around that time, so he won't even notice I'm gone. Do you have everything ready?" Julia replied. "Yes, everything is set and ready to go. See you then." Henry was stunned. Why were Julia and Andrea meeting behind his back? And why couldn't Henry know about this? This conversation only raised more questions, but at least he knew what to do. So he drove to work and canceled the meeting he would have at 12 himself so Julia wouldn't suspect anything. After that, it was a waiting game. Henry found himself unable to concentrate on anything. His thoughts kept drifting off to what would happen this afternoon. Will his divorce be destroyed after today? Or was Andrea really planning a surprise? No, he thought. He kept repeating what Tommy had said in his head to keep himself from doubting. And then it was time. Around 11:30, Henry walked over to Julia and told her he would be in a meeting in his office. Julia believed him, of course, and said she wouldn't let anyone inside. But around 11:50, Henry heard Julia leaving. This was it. This was his cue. Henry cracked the door open and saw Julia leaving the office. He quickly grabbed his jacket and followed behind her. He waited until she was in her car before he got in his car himself. He stayed 2 cars behind her at all times so she wouldn't notice him. And to his surprise, his plan worked. She drove to a quiet restaurant just outside of town. Wow, they really don't want to get caught, Henry thought as he parked his car a little further down the street. He watched Julia's every move from inside his car and only got out when he was certain she wouldn't see him. When he got out, Henry walked to the back of the restaurant. There he noticed Andrea's car in the parking lot. He figured they would recognize him immediately if he were to walk through the front door, so he wanted to see if there was a way in from the back. And there was, but it was straight through the kitchen. So Henry walked around the restaurant a second time while looking through the window. This was when he noticed Andrea and Julia sitting together at the bar. They faced the entrance with their backs, so if he were to get in quickly, they wouldn't notice him, hopefully. So he quickly stepped inside the restaurant. Luckily for him, there was no bell above the door so that he could enter without much noise. He picked a booth behind Julia and Andrea, just close enough to listen to their conversation. And as he ordered a drink, a third person sat down with them. The third person was a tall man who looked a little bit like Julia. "Dave, you made it," Julia yelled as she got up and hugged the man. "Hi, sis. Good to see you," he said with a crooked smile on his face. Sis, Henry thought. What the heck is going on here? But what the man said next shocked Henry even more. "Hey," Andy Dave said while kissing Andrea on her cheek. "Andy." Henry thought furiously. No one calls her Andy unless they really know her. Henry didn't know what to think. He watched with disgust at the trio, laughing and eating together. After a few hours, Julia said goodbye and left. Henry ducked down in his booth so she wouldn't see him, and to his surprise, it worked. Blah. But now only Andrea and Dave were left, and it looked like they knew each other very well. Andrea even had her hand on Dave's knee. Henry couldn't take it anymore, but something told him to wait a little longer, and his patience paid off, because within 10 minutes of Julia leaving, Dave kissed Andrea. Henry couldn't believe his eyes. He immediately took out his phone and snapped a picture for his attorney. No way Andrea would get away with this. After snapping the picture, Henry stood up and calmly walked over to Andrea. He cleared his throat, and Andrea quickly pulled away from Dave. "Henry," she said in shock. "What are you doing here? I knew something was going on as soon as I heard Tommy say something about his new baby sister." "I'm not an idiot, Andrea. When my son says that his sister looks like his other daddy, of course I'll get to the bottom of that." Andrea was in shock. She didn't know what to say, but Dave looked just as shocked. He clearly had no idea the baby was his. But Henry had no time to stay any longer. He left the restaurant and drove straight to his lawyer's office. He had called about a week ago to ask for the divorce papers, so he would be able to divorce Andrea on the spot. With the documents in his hand, he drove home. There, he signed the papers and left them on the kitchen counter. Then, he packed his and Tommy's bags and left. He took Tommy to a hotel where they would stay until the divorce was final. After that, they moved back home. Andrea had to look for her own place and temporarily moved in with Dave. Henry got full custody of Tommy, and Andrea was only allowed to see him on the weekends. She got nothing out of the divorce, but Dave was very happy to be a father. Andrea and Dave later married and had 2 more children together. Henry eventually found love again as well, and the 4 of them ended up being excellent co-parents.